Hi, everyone. On behalf of the Global Development Assistance Program, I'd like to welcome you all to this webinar on the use of Earth observation for monitoring and evaluation. This webinar is one of a series of webinars hosted by Caribou Space and Imperative Space. And essentially, they form part of the monitoring and evaluation activity of the European Space Agency's Global Development Assistance Program. So on behalf of the GDA program, Caribou Space has published a report in May 2023 called Using Earth Observation for Monitoring and Evaluation. The topical report is available on the GDA website and has received a lot of traction. So we're all very excited to be discussing some of the contents of that today. And before I continue, please note that we will be recording this session and we'll be taking questions from the chat box at the end. Thank you. And so to introduce the panelists we have here today, we have three main panelists: Alex Chunet, who's the European Space Agency's representative to the World Bank; Bernhard Metz, he's a senior operations officer and also the program manager of Geo-Enabling Initiative for Monitoring and Supervision. And finally, we have Marty here, a research analyst for the Development Impact Evaluation team at the World Bank. We also have Chris Aubrecht. He is the program coordinator of ESA's Global Development Assistance Program, who will be introducing the GDA program in a bit. And I myself will be representing Caribou Space, hosting this webinar. I will now pass it on to Chris to provide an introduction to the Global Development Assistance Program. Thank you.
Thanks a lot, Carlotta, for setting this up. So I will keep it very short. I don't want to take much of the time because I think we have an exciting lineup of panelists, and I'd like to keep most of the time for them. So just in a nutshell, what is the GDA program? It's an ESA program that in itself as a standalone program wouldn't work. So this may sound strange now, but it makes sense if you look at who we have as co-panelists here, namely colleagues from the World Bank. The GDA program is set up so in collaboration with international financial institutions such as the World Bank. And there's a clear task, in a sense, task distinction, where ESA focuses on its key strengths, and the IFI partners do the same, and we work in partnership and in complementary manner. So if we look now at the M&E topic, it's something that recently gained increasing attention in the Earth observation, I would say, community. So while it is something very established in the, let's say, development assistance domain, in the Earth observation domain, it's maybe less so. In GDA, we have a dedicated M&E action. So that is not using EO for M&E, but in a sense, it's using M&E for EO. But it kind of indicates that we pay quite a lot of attention to that, to really monitor what we do, try to optimize what we do, and amplify and accelerate the impact we generate. There have been a series of events, actually, most recently, focusing on the topic of Earth observation for monitoring and evaluation. I just highlight two. One was organized actually by the Netherlands Space Office, who have a program called Geodata for Agriculture and Water. And they have a keen interest in that. So we are having discussions on that one. And fairly recently also, there was another event organized at the UN Food and Agricultural Organization, where all the impact evaluation teams of the different IFIs came together to discuss how geospatial data and Earth observation can be used. So it's clear that there is increasing appetite also in the IFI community, and we in the GDA program try to capitalize on that and now also leverage GDA tools to address this topic. The first one, actually, where we really try to have a dedicated focus on it is the GDA app, the analytics and processing platform, which recently kicked off. So we'll have a dedicated use scenario on monitoring and evaluation there. And we are considering actually even going further than that with a dedicated activity on EO for M&E. This is still to be confirmed and to be shaped in a sense. So with that, I actually stop here. I would like to, hand back to Carlotta and look forward to listening to this exciting panel today. Thanks.
Thanks a lot, Chris, for that useful introduction to the GDA program for the people that aren't aware of it so far, and to its various initiatives. We'll now be hearing from our three panelists, starting with Alex Chunet, who will provide us with a background on Earth observation and monitoring and evaluation at the World Bank.
Thanks a lot, Carlotta. And hello, everyone. Happy to be here with you today and to present on the use of Earth observation for M&E, with a particular focus, of course, on the context of international financial institutions. So first, I would like to come back on a few basic principles and more specifically, the definition of M&E, to use this as the bedrock rock for this conversation. So according to World Bank's evaluation principle, M&E refers to monitoring and evaluation, which are two different, although linked concepts. Monitoring is defined as an ongoing process of observing, collecting, and analyzing information to gain a better understanding into whether a process, program, project, theme, strategy, or policy is achieving the expected outcomes. And on the other hand, evaluation is an objective assessment of the effectiveness of, again, a process, program, project, theme, strategy, or policy, and helps to determine whether it meets its objectives, to estimate its impact, and or to assess whether the benefits outweigh the costs. So while monitoring and evaluation are two different types of exercises, they are often used as a single unified concept, considering the very tight links that exist between them and their reciprocal value, basically. Then we might wonder, why is M&E, monitoring evaluation, so important, right? So, well, first of all, M&E is necessary to ensure the right implementation of development projects, and therefore translating in higher efficiency, but it is also about increasing the impact of those interventions through exercises of evaluation, which will allow to draw conclusions that can be used to improve the design of subsequent interventions and projects. In addition, M&E is also becoming increasingly important in a time of growing public scrutiny of development programs, and as increased demand for measuring results and impact by current and potential donors, who want basically those donors to know how funds are being used, whether they are being used effectively, and whether projects and programs being implemented are really successful in achieving the intended goals, right? So in order to ensure its usefulness, M&E considerations need to be integrated from the very beginning of a project cycle, starting with the articulation of the measurement framework itself, the design of data collection processes, ongoing monitoring activities, and then, of course, post-program evaluation upon completion, right? So this is really something that goes through the project cycle from the very beginning to the end of the project or the program that is being monitored or evaluated. So in the context of international financial institutions, we can see the approach and the way it's framed as a two-layered approach. As some of you probably already know, international financial institutions are not the ones implementing the projects, but they actually provide financing to governments or implementing agencies who are then in charge of project implementation. So the borrower in charge of project implementation carries out the activities linked to the M&E system designed for the project. And on the other hand, the IFI, the International Financial Institution, so the development bank, such as the World Bank, basically performs supervision to ensure that the borrower complies with the provision of the financing agreement and the environmental and social standards. So I won't spend too much time on this because some of my colleagues might dive slightly deeper into this, but it is important to note that both M&E processes and supervision are often implemented by third-party entities which are hired to implement those activities by either the international financial institution or the borrower, right? And this is something probably my colleagues will come back to. Now we might wonder, what does Earth observation has to do with M&E, right? So EO technologies actually offer significant benefits for the implementation of M&E activities, and their value can be explained through its key characteristics. The first one being affordability. So thanks to its remote acquisition, Earth observation data can make third-party monitoring and evaluations more affordable, particularly when accessed freely through typically the Copernicus program, considering that all the data from the Copernicus program and Sentinel missions is free and open. Another criteria would be coverage. Satellites have global coverage, allow access to remote and conflict areas, and are comparable across different countries. So the data also enables certain measures that might otherwise not be possible to obtain on the ground. A third criteria would be the frequency and speed. EO data can be obtained at varying temporal frequencies up to multiple times per day and can be made available very quickly. So this is particularly useful in evaluating projects that are time sensitive, such as agricultural planting timings, right? The fourth one, and there are 6 in total, is the objectivity. EO data is less susceptible to biases that may occur from human observations, and that might impact, for example, typically surveys when they are deployed. That is also linked to the fifth, which is anonymity, right? Unlike face-to-face data or specific survey approaches, satellites can make observations on the ground without being noticed and without collecting personal data. And finally, last but not least, continuity. The reality is that some Earth observation data series date back from the 70s. So the use of Earth observation data basically enables observations to be made to the same area of interest over a long period, and then allows basically to come back to the past, but also to project itself in the future, because a lot of those constellations that are currently in orbit will remain in orbit for several more years and will be potentially replaced by other constellations, right? So there is a continuity both in terms of past observations and potential future observations too. So in order to make this more concrete, I wanted to show you a few examples of the use of Earth observation for M&E. First, I wanted to take this example of the Coastal Resilient Infrastructure Project in Bangladesh, which is a project co-financed by IFAD, AFDB, KfW, and which was implemented in 12 coastal districts from 2013 to 2019. So by building or rehabilitating climate resilient roads and markets in economically disadvantaged rural areas or places that are highly vulnerable to natural disasters and climate change, the project really aimed to improve the livelihoods of poor households. That basically its development objective and its mission. However, travel restrictions and social distancing requirements during the COVID-19 pandemic meant that field visits and in-person meetings were not possible. And therefore, GIS data and virtual imagery from freely available sources were used to compensate for this absence. And the great natural experiment was actually the cyclone that happened in 2020, which allowed to evaluate how well the infrastructure built could withstand this kind of impacts and shocks. Another example, which is not only based on observation, but goes a little further in the actual analysis of the satellite imagery, is the one about an IFAD-funded agricultural support project in Georgia. So this project essentially was evaluated by the Independent Office of Evaluation of IFAD. And what they did is that they focused on the difference in vegetation development using an indicator called the NDVI between 2013 and 2016. However, it's important to note that the NDVI variations may be due to the intervention itself, but it may also be because of seasonal weather conditions, the stage of development of the vegetation, and changes of agricultural practices. Therefore, what they did is that they matched clusters with demographic and geospatial characteristics prior to the intervention, and non-treated sites with similar characteristics were identified and compared to treated sites. So this enabled, in the end, IFAD to be able to get a much more accurate comparison of sites because of a data-driven matching process and ability to compare NDVIs. And as you can see on this slide in the pictures, there is significant impact in terms of the growth and higher density of vegetation in 2016. A third and last example I wanted to quickly share with you is the example of investments related to regional trade investment in Central Asia, supported and facilitated by the World Bank. So the World Bank has been supporting Central Asian countries to enhance regional trade investment and connectivity for quite a few years. However, in these areas, informal trade forms actually a large portion of regional trade and is often not recorded in official statistics, which can be detrimental to policy design and recommendations. Ad hoc surveys are sometimes conducted. However, these are not done regularly and are prone to underreporting. So we come back to the benefits of EO that I was explaining before. So the World Bank has identified Earth observation's potential in filling the gaps to some of these data requirements. And in fact, growth in informal cross-border trade often leads to densification of bind main structures in the local hinterland, which can be observed using Earth observation. So essentially, in this example, Earth observation methods were used to observe the peri-urban landscape of inland markets as a proxy to estimate current or past informal trade. So it's kind of a land use analysis that was performed here to identify the growth in certain classes that could be related to informal trade. So that gives you kind of a few examples of how this goes and how it could be used, how Earth observation can be used in the context of monitoring and evaluation. However, we should not underestimate, and this is potentially also something my colleagues will come back to, or we can come back to in the discussion, we should not underestimate the limitations and binding constraints, which could limit the value of Earth observation technologies for M&E. So first, there is, of course, a question of limited scope in terms of the topics and sectors that can be covered. The nature of remote sensing means that it lends itself most to tracking observable changes in physical features, such as forestry mapping or changes to urban structure. However, from a thematic perspective, there are certain types of development interventions where a more nuanced understanding of changes to social structures or human development may be required, and such changes cannot be observed using Earth observation data. So this is kind of a general limiting or a general obstacle or a limiting factor to the use of EO. However, there is two other binding constraints that are important constraints to the use of EO, but that actually can and should be addressed for the use of EO in M&E. And more specifically, if geospatial data to be used, if geospatial data is to be integrated into IFI project processes such as ongoing monitoring and evaluation, it is absolutely necessary for improved information management on projects to enable this. So, for example, in many instances, projects that are being implemented are not properly geolocated, and so the IFIs, the development banks, and often even the client itself do not have the exact geodata corresponding to the location of that project. So that's something very rudimentary, but basically, of course, if you do not have the geolocation of your project, you will not be able to use Earth observation. And that's why we need an update and basically to release or resolve these kind of binding constraints to make sure that we can apply Earth observation as an M&E tool. The third binding constraint is linked basically to lack of complementary skill set. So within the M&E process of IFIs, the presence of M&E professionals with the relevant skills to use geospatial data effectively is very important, right? And this skill set is by no means widespread, and it will require a conscious effort to be taken to recruit professionals with the relevant experience. So that's another dimension that can be addressed and should be addressed if we want to ensure the uptake of EO within M&E processes. So as a last slide, one quick last slide on the project or the activity that was actually mentioned by Christoph in the beginning of this webinar. So in order to address basically some of those binding constraints that I was mentioning just before, ESAS through its GDA program has recently launched a new activity named the GDA Analytics Processing Platform. And this activity consists in a processing environment powered by European public cloud resources and aimed at targeting the specific requirements, information needs, and working practices of IFIs and their clients in the context of international development activities or projects. So EO for M&E has actually been identified as one of the cardinal use scenarios or use cases which will be addressed through this activity, which will allow international financial institutions to explore the value of EO for M&E further than they have to date, right? Because it's exactly about addressing some of the constraints. The cross-cutting nature of M&E fits in well with the cross-cutting user-oriented software tools that GDA app will provide. And additionally, it will help closing the awareness gap about the value of EO for M&E amongst client state and development stakeholders, which is still basically another dimension that we should work on. There is clearly a lack of awareness of the use of and the potential of those tools within beneficiary countries and in client states, and then this will be one of the tools that we can build on to kind of achieve higher awareness. So I'll stop here. Thank you very much, everyone, and happy to answer any questions in the second part of the webinar. Thank you.
Thank you, Alex. Thank you for introducing some of these concepts to us, helping us understand the benefits that Earth observation brings compared to traditional data collection methods, as well as showcasing some of the case studies and limitations of EO for M&E. As he mentioned, feel free to add questions in the chat box. We'll now be hearing from Bernhard Metz, who will be giving us insights into the sort of supervision side of all of this by talking about Geo-Enabling Initiative for Monitoring and Supervision. On to you, Bernhard.
Okay, great, thanks. I hope you can hear me. Before starting, I want to recognize that I'm not alone. My supervisor is right next to me, very closely supervising me. But now into the presentation, let me share my screen. And I understand I have 10 minutes, right?
Yeah, that's right.
I shall track the time because, as some of you know, I have a tendency of blah-blahing it away, and I shall try to avoid it this time. Can you see my screen? Okay. Okay, so first I was asked to quickly introduce what Geo-Enabling for Monitoring and Supervision stands for, the GEMS initiative. And I think it's actually quite relevant here to take this apart because it has both words in it, monitoring and supervision. If you put those words into Google, it will tell you those are synonyms. It's the same thing. But for development banks and then our clients, those are very different animals, as Alex already hinted to. Monitoring, as Alex described, is what the clients are doing when they're implementing projects. So the daily work of monitoring and evaluation so that we enhance implementation. Supervision is the fiduciary requirement of the development banks, of the lenders, be they a multilateral development bank or a bilateral development bank, which means we have to check if the money is invested the right way, we do no harm, and we reach the intended goals. Now, monitoring and supervision are connected mandates, but they're quite different. Supervision is a much, much smaller mandate. You know, in most cases, the World Bank needs much less data and information than the clients themselves. It generally needs to be aggregated. We don't need details. We don't want to have details on many things already for data protection reasons, etc., etc. Now, what GEMS does, inter alia, is trying to upstream build capacity in monitoring, meaning with the clients, very much focused on the clients, the governments and the project implementation units, so that downstream we also enhance World Bank supervision, while of course building capacity in M&E, in project monitoring is a development objective by itself. Now, very quickly to the beginning of the word, geo-enabling. Geo, as you may figure, relates to geospatial data, geographic information, and geographic perspective. And it very much relates to our work, contributing to finding the needle in the haystack. So as Alex just said, it doesn't help if you don't know where your projects are. That's one of the things that we are doing, helping to actually geotag them. Enabling is the most important word, and I want to get into this a little bit more because it's about capacity building. So it's not about selling some kind of contract or providing big picture guidance or so, but rather to really work hands-on with the counterparts in the country to build their capacity that they can run these systems by themselves independently. We are part of the Fragility, Conflict, and Violence group in the World Bank, but we are basically working on over 100 countries now, so we're not limited to that. Final point, when we created GEMS at the beginning, we considered calling it Geo-Enabling for Remote Monitoring, but then we figured that the acronym GERM is somewhat less appealing than GEMS. Here are my cats. Why am I showing you my cats? Well, two reasons. Number one, I always need to show everybody my cats, and one of them you might recognize. The other reason is to make the point that we need M&E and supervision to get more transparency and accuracy into development decisions. Now, again, why am I showing you my cats? Well, I'm currently not wearing my glasses. If I move away from my screen, I see 4 cats. But if I put on my glasses or I come a little bit closer, I realize, well, it's actually only 2 cats because the other 2 cats are fake. So the point that I want to make is that M&E and Earth observation is part of it, but also general M&E provides us with these glasses. It gives us a closer insight on what is actually happening on the ground, so we actually see what is fake and what is not fake. But as you may imagine, the picture of the cats was there before, and I just needed to create a narrative around it so I can show you my cats. So the idea of GEMS is to give our counterparts the ability to get eyes on the ground where they cannot always have boots on the ground or feet on the ground, This is important for any kind of project, but particularly for projects like this one that is implemented in northeast Nigeria, Boko Haram area, extreme violence, extreme access constraints. And so this is an area where the use of EO makes a significant difference. Not because nobody can ever go there, because sometimes people tell me, oh, we have this project there and we need to supervise it, but nobody can go there. And then I ask, well, if nobody can go there, who implements the project? Somebody must be there to implement the project. But because not everybody can go there, because we cannot go there always, and because it's maybe not the right counterparts that can go there, and so we need a way to really verify what is happening on the ground. And in this regard, GEMS, my team, tries to help setting up monitoring systems so we really know what is happening there. Now, this already describes a little bit one of the caveats. This is a monitoring system for this water point, but it's a tiny water point. So you need high resolution imagery, very high resolution imagery to even see it. So in this case, actually, most of the data is collected through other means. But, in principle, we can follow up with satellite imagery, with EO, and for other kinds of projects, obviously EO can be a main part of it. And this brings me to my punchline slide that at least Chris probably has seen for 6 years, because I'm so lazy that I don't create new slides. I just use the same again and again, but I think here it's quite fitting. So when we are talking about M&E through technology, let's say, we are summarizing this through the 3 sciences. The first one, and that's the topic of the session, is the rocket science, meaning remote sensing through EO, through satellite imagery. I call this rocket science for 2 reasons. Number one, these things are literally launched by rockets. Number 2, because you call something in English rocket science that is complicated, complex. Not everybody can do it. And that's a little bit the issue with EO. Now, Earth observation becomes easier by the day. Resolutions get better, frequency gets better, ways of processing it gets better, and eventually the accessibility of our counterparts gets better. And this is why I'm such a fan of the GDA program and the focus on capacity building and bringing it as close as possible to our counterparts. But it can still be somewhat complex, and not everything, as you know, can be done through rocket science. Therefore, we are also focusing on and here's my punchline, pocket science. I'm pulling my phone out of my pocket. You don't see my pocket, but just imagine my pocket. So what we are trying to do is systematically taking 15 years of a step back with our clients and helping them using something that I have been carrying around in their pocket for ages, namely simple smartphones to actually collect structured and geotagged data on the ground, which then feeds back into a monitoring system. Now, the geotagging obviously then helps with satellite imagery analysis with EO, because then we have found the needle in the haystack. And to summarize this kind of process, and also because I needed another OCCET, because 2 OCCETs, you always need 3 bullet points. That's at least what McKinsey says. There's also the socket science. A socket is something that you plug into to get electricity or data out of it. And so now you see my time running. And so what we mean with this is helping our clients to set up a system where they can combine these different sciences and plug into data sets to overlay them and to draw conclusions. So for instance, geotagging project sites and then having a spatial platform in which they can overlay the data with satellite imagery or with other polygon point line data that might come, or raster data that might come from other sources, to draw conclusions on project implementation. Now, I have more slides, but I want to stick a little bit to this one. The rest of the slides would describe how we are actually doing it, what we are doing, but I think I can actually bring this up later in the discussion. So I might just stick with this one for now. There's a couple of weird points here that don't seem to mean very much. So I have like this panel here that I need to move around. So the first one is there is no such thing as a World Bank project. Well, some people might think, what? Are there thousands of World Bank projects? No. There is no such thing as a World Bank project. They're World Bank funded projects. But the projects, the beneficiaries, the water points, the schools, the roads, the agricultural fields, all of that belong to our clients. And this is extremely important in terms of designing a good M&E system, because as mentioned before, monitoring and evaluation is something that needs to be done by the clients, that needs to be integrated in their work. Supervision is a very, very limited mandate. There's only so much data that we need. Sometimes I have the impression that, people do like fancy stuff in supervision because they like it and they find it cool and they want to get an award for having used technology. But if you really want to influence project outcomes, you need to start upstream. You need to invest in client ownership. And that is, of course, also extremely important when it comes to Earth observation. And this relates to the second point. Let me check the time. Oh, I'm running out. BE versus RE. What does that mean? Beneficiary executed versus, that was wrong. Bank executed versus recipient executed. It's about the funding. It's about how projects are designed. It doesn't help so much if we bring Earth observation into the World Bank and make the World Bank people understand it, because our budget and our, again, focus on implementation monitoring / supervision is quite limited. Where we need to bring these skills, and then again, the budget is the actual projects on recipient, on client side. Lost in translation, geekish versus TTL-ish, and that relates now a bit to the barriers of uptake and somewhat also to what Alex just said. And by the way, just during your session, Alex, I shamelessly made a copy-paste of your graph there and put some stuff in there. So this was done a couple of minutes ago. What does that mean? Well, it means that there's a lot of tech knowledge out there, particularly in the geospatial world, including within the World Bank. And these tech teams have a tendency of, they know everything about the tech, but they are, at least this is how I say it, they are speaking geekish because they're geeks, not in a negative sense, in a very positive sense. And then there are the so-called task team leaders, the TTLs, the project teams, the sector specialists. They know everything about agriculture, education, health, etc., but they don't know technology. So often there is something lost in translation. And so what we need to do, we jointly, myself, my team, and you guys, is to try to bridge this gap and help translate. So what does 10-meter resolution with a certain frequency actually mean potentially for an agriculture project? And what does it mean for a social protection project? Probably not much for the latter, but probably a lot for the former. Who is we? Well, I very often have discussions about the use of technology to improve project implementation and so on. And then often people say, and then we can run artificial intelligence on this, and we can analyze these satellite imagery, and we can run NDVI and so on. Then I always wonder, so who is we? Is that the tech specialist sitting in the World Bank, who in the end actually doesn't have much to do with the project? If it's that, then we're doing it wrong, because it needs to be the person who sits in the government, in the ministry, in the project implementation unit, ideally in the ministry, because PIUs, project implementation units, get dissolved after the project. So we really need to focus on local capacity. And then finally, I'm running out of time. I ran out of time. Sorry about this. Expectation management. And expectation management very much relates to the point that Alex addressed. EO can be extremely powerful in many contexts, in agriculture, large-scale infrastructure, and maybe a bunch that I am not even aware of, but not in all of them. And we need to be absolutely clear and really focus on what works best. And then in this context, and I'm almost done, address these points. Those were all points that Alex pointed out as advantages of Earth observation, and I very much agree with this. But playing the devil's advocate, there are always caveats or questions around them. And maybe I can bring this up in a discussion if you still want to give me the work, because I was already over time. That's it for now. Maybe I can show you a few more cat pictures. Cat, there's always a cat. I don't know if you see the cat. There's also a cat. There's no cat. No, there's a cat. Then there's a cat. But now I'm jumping out of the presentation and unshare my screen. Thank you.
Thanks a lot, Bernhard. I've never seen so many cats in one presentation, but they were thoroughly appreciated. Thank you for detailing some of what GEMS does, but I'm excited to hear you answering some of the questions on the work of the case studies that you've been doing. We will now hear from Robert Marty, who will be discussing the role of Earth observation in development impact evaluation at the World Bank. Handing over to you, Bernhard. Robert.
Okay, perfect. Yeah. Thank you, everyone, and good morning, afternoon, evening, depending on where people are sitting. I'm sorry this presentation will probably disappoint in terms of cat pictures, but I guess that was made up for in the last presentation. But my name's Marty. I'm a research analyst with the Development Impact Evaluation team at the World Bank. And just to kind of give some context about what DIME is a department within the bank that works to generate high quality and operationally relevant data and research. So we work with especially World Bank projects to embed data and impact evaluation into the projects to kind of really think about how we can embed experimentation and other kind of data and monitoring into the project to kind of use data to inform what's worked, what doesn't, what should be kind of like scaled up and so forth. And then we're kind of divided into 4 different broad pillars, which I've kind of outlined in the boxes and colors there. And I specifically sit within an infrastructure and climate change, and specifically within a unit called iConnect, which focuses on transport projects. That's why pretty much all the examples I'll be giving are all about transport. But just to kind of like give context, that DIME is a fairly large and growing department. So there's kind of Earth observation stuff going on kind of beyond what I'm talking about, but I'll kind of talk more about what I'm kind of more working with on the transport side. And then for the presentation, the main thing I'll be doing is kind of going through a few different examples of how we've embedded Earth observation into different projects, and I'll thinking about how we've kind of paired Earth observation with other data sources as well. So I'll be going through a couple of examples of using Earth observation to look at transport corridors, looking at economic activity, and also measuring changes in road use, and also a project that looks at infrastructure and pollution in Senegal. So the first project I'm talking about is Ethiopia's Road Sector Development Program, where this was more of a retrospective analysis that looks at a fairly extensive improvement in the road network in Ethiopia that happened starting in 1996, where there was over 100,000 kilometers of road that were built or rehabilitated in an effort to kind of help accelerate economic activity throughout the country. So we have really nice administrative data that we've gotten from the Ethiopian Roads Authority, which I'm kind of showing on the map of how the road network evolves over time, where we know where new roads were built and how the quality of the roads have improved. And then we're going to use a couple different Earth observation data sources to measure the impact of these road improvements on kind of economic activity and other outcomes that we might be interested in. So first is annual nighttime lights, which I think is becoming more common in economic literature as a source of local economic activities. There's a number of papers that show that nighttime lights is correlated with things we care about on the ground, such as economic activity and subnational income. So we kind of use this as a source for economic activity in the Ethiopia context. And then second, we're also gonna, in addition to nighttime lights, looking at a land cover data set to measure changes in urbanization that resulted from the road network. So here we're using a data set from the European Space Agency that starts in 1992 that when we use the data went until 2018. And this is available fairly granularly across the world at a 300-meter resolution. So just to show what the results look like for this, so the x-axis is the year since road improvement, and we're essentially running it differences design. We're comparing locations near roads that were treated, and the control group is locations that have yet to be treated. And we're seeing across especially the larger roads, which are in orange, these are kind of federal and major roads, as opposed to in black, which are kind of smaller, more rural roads. We're capturing increases in both nighttime lights, which is on top, and in urbanization. So we see the impacts of kind of this program generating their intended impacts of accelerating economic activity and leading to increased urbanization. And then just a quick second example of a fairly similar project that we're doing in Pakistan, where there were similarly large road upgrades and improvements across the country. In this case, we didn't have the similar administrative data that we got in Ethiopia, so we've kind of gone to high-res satellite imagery to create a data set of road improvements ourselves. We know kind of vaguely like the locations of where these improvements happen, but we could, again, just kind of go to the high resolution to capture these changes. So example on the left showing the same location in 2002 and 2020, where just from the imagery you see an improvement from an unpaved road to what looks like adding additional lanes and an improvement in the road network. So we do this across major roads throughout the country. And just kind of an example of one of the roads that we're looking at. So in one motorway connecting Islamabad and Lahore, there was an improvement that happened in 2016. So we're going to compare trends in nighttime lights to a similar nearby road, and comparing comparing the differences in nighttime lights, find that there was a large increase in nighttime lights due to this road in comparison to the control road. So again, a similar kind of framework to how we're thinking about using nighttime lights in Ethiopia, but in this case, we're also using the Earth's observation to generate the data on the improvement in the road network. And then as another example, we have a project in a rack that we're looking at where there was a new 23-kilometer segment that was built near the to kind of connect the Turkish border with the rest of Iraq. And here we're focusing on looking at changes in road use along this new expressway that was built. And basically this is kind of an important trade network where previously the road was like not designed for kind of these heavy freight trucks that were moving through Turkey. So the expressway was intended to help facilitate trade. And to look at road use, we're going to use two data sources. One in partnership with a company called Space Snow, that leverages synthetic aperture radar data, which we can use to essentially kind of capture metallic reflectance on the ground, which we use as a proxy for vehicles. So what this data source is really doing is help us capture congestion, and we can use congestion to look at, is there more congestion or more road use over time? And then we secondly pair this with data from OutLogic for GPS mobility data. So not kind of satellite imagery, but just as another different type of source to validate against each other. So when we look at trends in these two data sources along the road network itself, if we're looking at congestion and the metallic reflectance, we noticed before the road was built, there was a bunch of activity which we see from construction, and then we don't see a lot of activity, in contrast to the GPS mobility data, so where we see a fairly large increase in activity after the road was open. And the thought here is that the satellite imagery is more able to capture congestion as opposed to vehicles. So there could still be vehicles on the road, but we're not really capturing them in the satellite imagery because it's 10-meter resolution. You're only going to capture them if cars are bunched up together and really congested. So we also look at parking areas that are where you kind of would more expect cars to be congregated that the satellite imagery can capture. We look at this, in the satellite imagery, we do see an increase in activity after the road was built, and we similarly see that in the GPS mobility data. And just a quick final example, in a different context, we're using satellite imagery to measure pollution in Dakar, Senegal, looking at changes in infrastructure and how that corresponds to pollution, and we're validating this with pollution monitors that are installed throughout the city. So as one exercise, we're just going to compare, is the metrics from pollution that we're getting similar to what we're getting from satellite imagery, and we're able to kind of validate this fairly well. And this is intended to look at infrastructure changes. There's a new BRT system putting in place that this data system is intended to evaluate. But one specific example, just to again somewhat validate the data, is there was a new bridge that was opened where in the red you see trends in congestion, and the blue you see trends in pollution, where you see both congestion and pollution went down. So this is kind of how we're thinking about integrating pollution metrics both from on the ground and the Earth observation sources. So just for the final slide, thinking about Earth observation at DIME. So I think kind of like the bread and butter at DIME is typically kind of surveys on the ground as we kind of do randomization experimentation. But there's growing use of thinking about how Earth observation can be used, especially as we think about like new possibilities for what can be done with Earth observation. And as we kind of can think about new metrics and new things we can do with Earth observation, it's kind of continuing to make sure we kind of validate these metrics and think about, for nighttime lights, what actually is it measuring? For kind of other data sources, making sure we really understand what it's measuring to inform the evaluations that we're doing. So thank you so much.
That's great. Thank you a lot, Robert, for showcasing some of those case studies at DIME. We'll now be taking questions from the audience, but in the meantime, I've got a couple of questions on my own. I'll just ask my first one to Robert because you were just talking. So my question, you've kind of looked at and told us about really interesting case studies around DIME. And I was wondering how DIME shares its knowledge and learnings to other teams within the World Bank and potentially how it can do this more effectively.
Right. So we have a team in DIME called DIME Analytics, which is kind of designed to help work with kind of like training and building tools to kind of think about, what are the common things that are done across teams in DIME, and then we can kind of like standardize those into like trainings and tools that we can then present throughout the bank. And so far we've done a lot of trainings just on kind of like things like using R and Stata and Python, because those are common tools across the bank, and the current tools are more designed for kind of primary data collection from surveys. But I think as Earth observation is becoming more prevalent across DIME, we'll kind of think about building tools and trainings that are catered towards this, kind of like build the geospatial capacity among the team and kind of develop standardized trainings for that, and think about, what are the common Earth observation data sources from, whether it's like nighttime lights or NDVI that teams might commonly use. And we can think about, developing maybe, like standardized code from Google Earth Engine or other kind of like tools like that to kind of make it super easy for teams that might not have super experience in geospatial work, but just kind of make it fairly easy for them to use the data sources that are becoming more common. So I think that's something else we're thinking about, like what are the common data sources that are being used for impact evaluation, and kind of building tools and trainings catered for that.
That's great. Thank you. And Bernhard, you also mentioned a little bit about capacity building. You also talked about the complexity of what you called rocket science and some of the communication barriers between sector specialists and tech specialists. What have been some of the learnings that you've discovered through capacity building or through that conversation between people and trying to bridge that gap? You're on mute currently.
Sorry, I don't understand technology. Good question. It really depends on who that respective counterpart is, because we mostly engage with actual clients, with government counterparts, but then of course also within the World Bank with task team leaders and country management units. And what we have learned very often is basically what I have indicated, that there are two languages being spoken and both are experts in their languages, but they don't really translate. So there are, we have teams within the bank that are absolute experts on Earth observation, and they know all the technical bits, but obviously they are not so close to the agriculture, education, and health projects. And then there are the agriculture, education, and health task team leaders or experts that know everything about that topic, but they don't know how actually Earth observation could be helpful. So what we have learned is, and again, I'm kind of repeating what I said before, is that you need a translator in between. You need to have a connection to both of them. So somebody who understands a little bit of both and then explains to the agriculture person, for instance, that there is huge opportunities in using Earth observation, because for obvious reasons, physical, like also the analytics that go beyond visual data, there are huge opportunities for using Earth observation, and it's actually relatively easy to apply it, while explaining then to the to the technical person that, however, in order to apply it, you really have to make it as easy as possible. And we actually just talked about this, I think, this week with Alex and team, that, you know, the thing that I find so exciting about the new platform that they're building up is that it does precisely that it helps people use Earth observation data that have no respective background in this regard. So this needs to be broken down. And then other things that we have learned is that expectation management is important, and basically, again, in both directions. I have had, and Chris knows this, fascinating discussions with counterparts that wanted to use satellite imagery to track the attendance of one school somewhere in Nigeria, and like basically based on satellite imagery figure out how many people are going in there and out there, and so counting the students, and wanted to spend $500,000 on that because that person had a trust fund grant on $500,000. And then we had to explain, well, you know, there's so much better uses that you can make with these $500,000. Maybe for this specific thing, actually send somebody there with a smartphone, which costs you $500 and will give you much more precise data for many reasons, including technical ones. While then on the other hand, it's often the other way around, that where Earth observation could be extremely powerful, they are not aware of these use cases and they are not applying it. So expectation management in both directions. I hope that makes sense. Over.
Yeah, that makes perfect sense. Thank you for that clarification. We've got a question from the Q&A, and I'd like to ask this to Alex because you spoke a little bit about the benefits of satellite data as opposed to traditional methods and other ways of gathering data for monitoring and evaluation. And so I'll just read out this question. It says, how will the use of drones improve the possibilities of Earth observation in addition to these space-based systems?
Thanks, Carlotta, and thank you for the question. So indeed, I think they are very much complementary. In the end, it depends on the use case, right? Drones will allow you potentially to achieve higher resolution or even to observe some spectral bands, especially some radar bands such as L band that are not necessarily that common yet in the constellations that are in orbit, or not at the resolution that you would like them to be. However, of course, it has a cost, right? So it ends up being a cost-benefit analysis, whether the cost that you will pay kind of justifies how much you need this for the specific use case, or if the lower cost and potentially even free imagery you would get from satellites would be enough to apply to the use case or the application you had in mind. So that's kind of the trade-off here. They are complementary. They do not necessarily cover the same use cases. So they are not, I would say you would not necessarily replace one with the other, considering that you could achieve higher resolution with drones and again, potentially a wider spectrum. But if for the space where it does overlap, then it's a question of trade-offs in terms of a cost benefit. That's where what I would answer.
That's great. Thank you, Alex. Chris, I know, has his hand up. Would you like to ask a question or contribute to any of the answers, Chris?
Yeah, thanks a lot. And I see we have more in the Q&A, so I'll try to be brief. Maybe on the drone, just to complement, and Alex phrased it well, maybe there's one extra layer here. Especially in aftermath of disasters, drones are often used, and there, drones can fly below the clouds, right? Let's say there was a hurricane, it's always cloudy, and you need optical imagery, and the satellites can't see through the clouds, and then drones are useful. But I think a major downside is the repeatability, or how do you say, right? The frequency of observations, because satellites are there and flying around constantly, so you will get more and more, observations, whereas on drones you don't. Anyway. My question is actually both to Bernhard and to Robert. So probably Bernhard will feel addressed if I say, how can you actually herd all the cats, right? And let me translate that into a different type of question. So how do you get everybody to do this, right? So what does it take from your perspective, knowing that the bank pretty well, what does it take to move beyond pilots, right? So we've seen now lots of nice studies, and we have all the counterparts that we've been working on with as ESA over the years in the bank, and who like to do it and who will keep doing it. But how do we go beyond pilots to some kind of standardized use across an entire portfolio of, let's call it, applicable projects, because yes, it's an illusion that it can be every project in the bank. As you mentioned, we won't be able to observe who goes in and out of a school, but let's say the applicable subset of projects, which is still very big, right? Like almost every environmental project has a component where EO can play a role. So how do we make that step? I mean, we wanna help on that, right? That's why we have GDA established. So and in that sense, I would hope that both the GEMS team and the DIME team can be catalysts for change. Let's call it like that.
Wonderful. You just became my favorite person, Chris. I mean, you already were kind of. Can I quickly address this? And I will actually have to run then relatively soon for another meeting. But so very quickly, I think, there's always 3 points. So let me try to make 3 points again. And some of them I have already addressed. So the first one is really, really tackling this, making sure nothing is lost in translation and having this ongoing education, particularly on like really what works and what doesn't work, and then really focusing on this what works. Because otherwise there's also often a lot of disappointment. People think, oh, satellite imagery, because they have seen some kind of science fiction movie where there's a satellite flying into a building and telling you what happens in the basement there. Satellite imagery does everything, and then in the end it doesn't do what they want, and so they're disappointed and don't want to do it anymore. So this kind of translating and expectation management relatedly. Second one, focus on the right counterparts. The World Bank does not have the mandate of doing all these analysis and then actually feeding into the project, implementation. The supervision mandate of the World Bank is rather small. Obviously, there's also a whole work stream that you can support the World Bank. But if you really want to make a difference, then you need to get into the projects, into the actual recipient executed funding of the project as early as possible, and try to make it a standard that every agriculture project or every environment project or large-scale transport project considers this and already puts aside a certain budget to do this work. And then it's basically something that can even be copy-pasted in the project appraisal documents. And the third one is make it as easy as possible. Break it down. Really, really make it so, not to show off with GEMS, but the reason why GEMS has been so successful is because we do everything to make it easy. We do everything to basically give it into the hands of the counterparts and then even continue holding their hands. And so therefore, and again, we had a discussion earlier this week, I think, about the GDA app. That's the way to go. If you have something that you can directly give to the counterparts, even people who have no previous experience, have no clue about this, but you make it clicking a couple of buttons, then you can bring it into the daily workflow. TTLs, task team leaders in the World Bank, are incredibly busy. They have so many boxes to tick, and they will not even approach something new if it might help them afterwards, saving a lot of time, if you don't break it down so easily that they can just integrate it into their workflow. And a part of this is also partial standardization. So come up with and we talked about this with Alex as well, come up with a very specific approach for certain kinds of agricultural or whatever it might be analysis, so that 80% of this is already there, and then the 20% you just adjust to the specific context of the country / the project. I hope that makes sense. Over. Thanks.
Absolutely. But maybe Robert also has something to say, but just on your second point that you made in terms of, working directly with the client counterparts, I think that's a very important point. That said, that's the bank's mandate, right? The bank has the continuous policy dialogue with the counterparts in the countries. This is not necessarily ESA's mandate. It's something where we have, we also work directly with them, but I think in order to really mainstream something into from a procedural perspective, it's where we, two institutions need to get together and see, okay, how can we communicate that to the client, and how can we basically tell them that this is something that should be standardized, and then we can demonstrate it and try to roll it out. Yes.
Sorry, very quickly responding to this, obviously 100% true. Now you can help us, the bank, by making it as easy as possible for us to make it as easy as possible for them. And then we are just the middleman. My team has 40 people all around the world. If it gets so easy that they can just we can integrate it in one of our trainings or so, then we can make this a standard of what we're doing. Now, obviously, the trainings won't necessarily always do the trick, because you need to get in earlier when the projects are negotiated, when the budgets are defined, but still there, make it easy for us, and then we will try to get it into the conversations with the TTLs and the counterparts. I hope that makes sense. I have to run now, sadly.
Thanks a lot. No, I realize we are over time, so Carlotta, you manage. I know
Yes,
Robert wanted to say something still, but
I'm so sorry. I wish we had more time here, and this is a really interesting discussion. We're having a lot of interesting questions also in the table. But I think, if anyone wants to reach out to any of the panelists, please feel free to do so. And just to conclude this, we'll be sharing the recording with attendees via email, writing a blog post, and also sharing it on LinkedIn, on the GDA website. Just to take advantage of that, the GDA website is a one-stop shop for all of these kinds of resources. So please take advantage of that. And with that, I would like to thank Imperative Space and the team for your background support in organizing and communicating this webinar, Chris for the introduction to the GDA, and the rest of the panelists for all your insights. And thank you to the audience for asking questions and listening in and everything else. Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thanks.
thank you.